delighted that John Higgins is here for a conversation about tempered radicals, which is one of the things that Sarah just mentioned there at the end, and came through very strongly in our leadership lab full day session back in December. So John is a researcher, author, advisor, known for his work on organizational dynamics, power, and activism in the workplace. He was co-author along with Megan Reitz of a fabulous book called Speak Up, Say What Needs to Be Said, and also, more importantly, Hear What Needs to Be Heard, which focuses on navigating power differences and fostering more effective communication in the workplace. John and Megan have also more recently co-authored an interim report on spaciousness, Permission to Pause, which explores the need to create more reflective spaces in our busy lives and busy workplaces, amongst many other themes. And I was delighted to be part of the inquiry group on this need for spaciousness. So John, anything else to add to that bio before we get into our conversation? Have I missed anything important?
That felt more than enough.
Thank you.
Let's move on to the meat.
So one of the themes that came up through Lab 4 is this idea of tempered radicals, something that you've spent quite a bit of time researching. And I guess I'd just love to hear what do you mean, or what does the research point to in terms of what it means to be a tempered radical, and why might that be relevant to this group, and what are some of the challenges and tensions faced by tempered radicals in organizations?
I was just listening to Sarah take the field, and it was all about skills, and it's the idea that there are techniques to being an effective tempered radical, whatever that is. But being a tempered radical is personal. And it's almost like a curse. I've just come off a podcast earlier this morning where someone called Steve Hearson was presenting No Silver Bullet. And he had the wonderful idea of, the allure is that, if we learn how to do tempered radical, if we can turn it into a playbook, then all our problems will be solved. But for me, embracing tempered radicals, and I think everybody on this call would fall into that category, you are walking into a world of pain. I'd like to say it's an easy choice, but it is a difficult choice. And there is some sense that it's a choice that you can't walk away from. I'm very taken by the work of Ruchika Tulshan, who talks about the difference between, what to you might feel like a nice to, is to me something that is a fundamental human right. I think for anybody who steps into the purpose-led field, this is something that calls from their moral core. And you can't really, and how do you live that tension when you're surrounded by people who would view it more as a bolt-on or something we do in addition to, when this is something that's really fundamental to your identity? Let me just run through a few things that stood out to me, which bear little relation to the conversation we rehearsed a few days last week. I've been thinking about it a lot. And I'm just reminded of the Ali Smith book called How to Be Both. And it is this idea that you have this dual narrative, a troubled teen and this Italian Renaissance artist. And at some level, I never quite understood the book, but you've got these two lives which are being presented. And it is this idea of coexisting in two worlds at the same time, and how disturbing that is. I've also, again, if you want to go and look, and I think this is a great resource to draw on, is the work by someone called Barbara Banda, which is called The Model Black. And it's her experience of being a Black British leader. And when I started talking to her back in 2017, she was just going to do, ironically, she called it a vanilla leadership book because she was a leadership tutor. And then what she found was that, her experience of leadership was so wrapped up with her experience of being Black British that, she had to write about it from this personal perspective. And it is this idea that tempered radicalism is a personal experience. I was writing up a series of doctoral experiences where people were exploring different ways of coaching. And someone invited me, rather than telling me the story of how they went about their coaching, got me to experience it. And we went walking around the Cambridge Botanical Gardens. And she said, are you aware that Every time we're walking together, whenever we change paths, you move to the edge. This is her to me. And to me, that is exactly the position that a tempered radical is on. You are on the edge of things. And that means you have a certain clarity, you are more engaged with the world, but also it means you don't belong anywhere. I was just reminded of the Rudyard Kipling story, that the cat that walked by itself. And in that particular story, the dog just joins in and wants to be part of the human world and live in the cave, whereas the cat is the one that will sit at the mouth of the cave, still in the darkness and in the warmth of the light. So this is an existential challenge, not just a technique challenge. So now I'll move on to just say a few words about, where the term really came from. And it's by Deborah Meyerson and Maureen Scully. And they wrote a book called Tempered Radicalism and the Politics of Ambivalence and Change. It is a really relatively accessible read for an academic piece, and it just nails it. And it is this idea that, you are not just one thing. And in this case, they were talking about the experience of both being women in male environments, of being, I think, also what it's like being a person of color in a dominantly white environment. So it's this idea of wanting to succeed in both. And it is this idea of when people say you've got to choose, and that is the easiest route to go. And again, do you want to be purpose-led? Well, are you going to be part of the activist gang? Are you going to be a Just Stop Oil person? Or are you going to be, in the BP boardroom? You've got to commit. And it's this idea of, it's the refusal to commit one way or the other, hence the ambivalence. It is, I am both. And I'd like to link this to, I can't remember whether I did this at the lab or not, but a very esoteric paper called A Paradoxical Conception of Group Dynamics. And I promise you that the basic concept of it is much simpler. And it's to do with the nature of belonging and not belonging in groups. And again, this is something that tempered radicals live the whole time. And the idea is that you get invited to join a group, usually because of your difference. So if you are a champion of the purpose agenda, the executive team will say, yes, we wish you to come and join us. But this is the paradoxical conception. In order to stay a member of the group, you have to give up your difference. So you have to almost leave the purpose at the door. And often what something like the in-group, the executive group, don't realize is that they're the ones who have to do the work so that you can retain your difference. And often they think, this is great, we can cross our arms, we've got the purpose person on board. It's rather like, no. You are the ones who have to ensure that the purpose person has their voice. And it's really tricky. I've got a particular, I was musing about this. There's an experience where Surfers Against Sewage were approached by one of the water companies because the water company wanted to seriously engage with the protesters and the environmental activists. And they got somewhere and they were going to set up a working committee, but in the end, the people they were talking to, again, in Surfers Against Sewage, said that their members just would not tolerate them sitting down with what they would see as the opposition, which actually then reminds me of the story we did say I'd tell Dee, which was about this. Went back into the I think it was the late 80s, early 90s, and this is when the first manifestation of the pro-life, pro-choice debate blew up in the States. And you had the, bleakly ironic thing of people being, pro-lifers murdering people who were working in abortion clinics. And what happened in Boston was that someone convened a behind-the-scenes dialogue between members of the Catholic Church, pro-lifers, pro-choicers, and in a sense, all the people who the press would approach to make inflammatory remarks. And what they realized was this group spent time together and began to realize that each group was coming from their intentions were good, they weren't demons. And then what happened was they went public with the fact that this conversation between people who shouldn't be talking together were talking together. And the press immediately invited one of them to say, how on earth could you share a platform with this person. And so they were invited to fall back into the inflammatory language. And there again, the key sense that there was success at that point was when the person said, no, that's not the way to frame it. I am aware that the person that I sat down with, their values are good values. They are coming from a place of good intent. I may disagree with them. I do disagree with them. We weren't looking to convert each other. And again, if I was looking at, and this is, the very different things between being a revolutionary activist and a tempered activist and a tempered radical, is if you looked at the different manifestations of Stonewall over the last 30 years. You have Stonewall version 1.0, which was arguing for gay marriage, and that looked to build a broad coalition. It looked to find a unifying theme. In that particular case, it was around equality under the law. Whereas you can see with Stonewall 2.0, they've gone for a different strategy, which is to establish a very clear statement as to this is where we stand. And, if you don't agree with us, you are in opposition to us. And again, both are legitimate change strategies, but they obviously have very different profiles and require a very different action. And I would say that Stonewall 1.0 is much more of a tempered radical, which again, it's looking to engage with a world of difference rather than convert people. Sorry, that went on for far longer than I anticipated. Sorry, Dee.
No, fabulous. And just a couple of things. I mean, I totally agree that report from Deborah Scully was written in 1990s, and I could not believe it. And I felt, when I read it, I felt like, oh, this is giving me language and understanding of kind of like the tensions that show up for me. So even though I work for a Blueprint and we're a charity, we still work within the corporate world. And I often have my networks that are out of the corporate world, maybe on the more challenging side, which I think is important and necessary. But sometimes you can feel like you're not quite in that group, but also when you show up in the corporate world talking about what we're talking about, you also aren't always quite accepted either. So I kind of, and that we're always as a charity, but I think this is also relevant to people internally in organizations trying to agitate for change, trying to really hold to the depth and the quality of like what it means to be a purpose-led business, can often feel like you're always dancing on the edges. And I guess, yeah, even like just framing it as a dance sometimes helps me loosen the need for control and meeting an endpoint, and just work and dance with change a little bit more. And one of the other things that is in that report and that Sarah also mentioned was this jiu-jitsu metaphor. And I've used this a couple of times since, and it's a wonderful metaphor, and it has definitely resonated. But what does that mean? What can you give us a little bit more color to that metaphor and how you've seen that work in practice?
When we were rehearsing for this, I remember I stuck at a very generic level, and then I sort of went for a long walk, and it came to life for me, which was that I remember I was a few years ago, as part of the research into speaking truth to power, I was talking to a union rep in one of the universities, and exploring about how he saw the environmental campaigners within the university. And to me, he absolutely summarized it, which was what he really admired was that the environmentalists had a lot of energy. They didn't have a lot of procedure, they didn't have a lot of process, but boy, did they got you by the guts. But there was always this risk that, of course, they diffused very quickly. There wasn't the institutional heft to keep things going. And he said, if only, and he said this is where he was looking to do, which was to marry in his case, the traditions of unionization with its capacity to establish rules, establish procedures, have officers responsible, the bureaucracy of the status quo. And how can you use that to amplify the energy and the experience and the spontaneity of the activist? And to me, the jiu-jitsu is, how do you connect with and work with the enthusiasm of the marginalized group who have the energy, who really have the passion in their bellies? It matters to them. They will not walk away. And how do you also leverage the resources, the institutional capacity that exists within the organization? And that to me is the jujitsu, is understand what is the strength that I'm trying to play with here. And you know, being someone who's not good with bureaucratic process, I tend to overlook that and think, actually, once you've, you know, so that was it. So to say that, you know, the jiu-jitsu is the activist gets the thing on the agenda. It's the procedure, it's the unionization, it's the bureaucracy which keeps it on the agenda. That's the jiu-jitsu. Okay, I use this energy to get it on the agenda, and I use this energy to keep it on the agenda.
Yeah, and I guess also sometimes as tempered radicals, because this was also in the research, was you both need to leverage the hot-headedness and the cool-headedness. And so the hot-headed, like within you and within your groups, but like the hot-headedness kind of giving you the energy, the fire, as you say, getting something on the agenda, but keeping it on the agenda and trying to actually drive sustainable change requires cooling that down a little bit in order to sustain it. Yeah.
And I don't think you can do that both with one person. It's once you see, could you as the full of energy person, could you dial it down, and you can see you've now killed it. And this is the real tension for the tempered radical, is they're often drawn to want to be the one campaigning outside. There was a really good person I spoke to about this, where it was one of the, I've got to be careful I don't, right, yeah, no, I can know how to disguise this one. Okay, it's in a further education establishment of world renown. And they had one of the senior members of the faculty had made a series of misogynistic comments, and the women graduates and alumni were absolutely up in arms. And this woman, who was the insider, was the one, you know, negotiating inside so that the misogynistic man could leave in high esteem and leave with good grace, but leave. Outside the window, she could hear the demonstrators, and she wanted to be there with the demonstrators, but she had to stay absolutely cool, calm, and keep her personal feelings to one side, because getting the man off the faculty was what mattered.
Yeah.
And
when you tell that story, I feel like such a tension in my tummy, because I can see the need of what you needed to do, and yet I can find it slightly frustrating, which kind of, it's a beautiful story in many ways for like explaining what this kind of work, often the tensions that you sit with within this work, and sometimes the feeling of compromise in order to be able to make longer term impact.
And it is this, I mean, I think at the lab I used that there is this, you are shot by both sides, and it is an internal tension. You can feel, I am both am I a sellout or am I a hothead? Yeah. And it is, you get those labels thrown at you from both sides. And this is why having this external community is so important. You've got to have somewhere with people who feel what it's like to hold and live that tension.
Live that and don't feel judged in a space that you don't feel judged. John, the recent research you've been doing on spaciousness sounds like a completely different theme, right? But I don't think it is. Can you just, before we move people into some breakouts, just give me a sense of what you're seeing the connection between your long-standing research on power, tempered radicals, and this idea of spaciousness and attention?
The way I'm making sense of it is, within the frame, we talk about this doing mode and this spacious mode. And the temptation is to get busy. And what we want to avoid is staying with the spacious mode, which is a more, let's stay with the inquiry, let's stay with the doubt, let's stay with the existential challenge that Sarah was framing, which is a deeply uncomfortable space to be in. We're much more conditioned to, let me rush into action. And that is, to borrow the Margaret Heffernan quote, this is almost like, you know, willful busyness is such an easier thing to do. Rather than say, we need to stay with not knowing for longer. And that's why, and at a very pragmatic level, I noticed you brought the measurement thing forward. And one of the things, you know, right back in the early 90s, I used to work in the company that was founded by Dave Norton, who was one of the two people who came up with the balanced scorecard idea, Norton and Kaplan. And this got utterly traduced over the years. But its basic premise was that, you know, financial performance is a lagging indicator. the things that is the best predictor of forward is in your learning and development. And in practice, when we're talking about shifting, understanding, attitudes, knowledge, dialogic capacity, it is in our learning and development. It's in taking something like the customer experience seriously that we can begin to change hearts and minds. But the point is that if you look at what's happened, is that the balanced scorecard has been rubbished. I mean, it's been turned into this dreadful mechanistic thing, which has continued to trivialize what it means to learn and develop. And to me, the purpose community can you reclaim the balanced scorecard, please? And say, can we put the purpose is what should be informing your learning and development, which is your future.
Yeah. And I think there's a huge connection between the long-standing work and research around what it means to be a learning organization and becoming a purpose-led organization as well. Like, I think, that orientation towards learning, curiosity, not knowing is a huge part of that. And actually, partly what we want to unpack in this measurement lab is what is our relationship within the organization to measurements? Like, does it become end goals in and of themselves? Are they inputs into what we can do and how we can be a better organization?
Just leaping in there for a second. And this is one of our course. I don't know if you were part of this inquiry group. We had someone who is the head of learning and development from one of the world's biggest corporations. And she said that whenever anybody from sort of the front line came and attended one of her courses, they had to record it on their timesheets as non-productive time. So she was the head of non-productive activity. And that's part of the framing of, you've got to challenge this in the purpose community. Is to realize that learning matters.
And language matters as well, and how you talk about it. I'm going to ask one very last question because I meant to ask it earlier, and I think it's quite important. One of the questions within the leadership lab wasn't necessarily what defines a purpose-led leader and the capabilities and all of that. I mean, that was part of it. But another question was, what are the conditions that we're creating? And you pointed earlier to, you can have your tempered radicals, but like, in a way, the orientation of a purpose-led business needs to look at what are the conditions that are surrounding that tempered radical. So if, for example, someone, I think the example you use is someone, purpose, sustainability on the leadership exec team, and then they go, great, we've got that person. But actually it's about the conditions that are being created by everyone, right? Within the organization, particularly senior leaders around that. And another point that came up through the lab was, is tapping into how psychologically safe to those people in terms of radicals, employee network groups, sustainability teams, how psychologically safe do they feel in an organization, potentially being a good indicator for the desire for an organization to really shift and change. So I just want to talk just very briefly before we move into breakout, just that question of like the conditions, the organizational conditions that we need to look to support tempered radicals.
The phrase that just came to my mind, you've got to legitimize doubt. And that is a huge shift because so many of our business processes are set up to eliminate doubt because we want to rush certainty. And we're also so incredibly future focused that we don't stay with what do we already know? How do we make it okay for ourselves to be a community without unity? Again, I can't remember, you were saying that you've done a work about the curse of alignment. And part of this is about, we've got to strip ourselves back a bit from the mantras of the last 30 years of everybody singing from the same hymn sheet. And it is this thing of how do we legitimize it's okay to see the world differently? Because that then releases so much energy, because again, we've got all this energy going into people doing the performative. I will pretend to go along with the corporate Kool-Aid, while in my own life, I will do something completely different. Which means you're just not tapping into the energy because people are faking it.